signaling you through the flames. The North Pole is not where it used to be. Manifest destiny is no longer manifest. Civilization self-destructs. Nemesis is knocking all the doors. What are poets for in such an age? What is the use of poetry? The state of the world calls out for poetry to save it. If you would be a poet, create works capable of answering the challenge of apocalyptic times, even if this meaning sounds apocalyptic. You are Whitman, you are Poe, you are Mark Twain, you are Emily Dickinson, you are Neruda and Mayakovsky and Pasolini, you are an American or non-American. You can conquer the conquerors with words. This is an opening poem from Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Dear all, dear guests, dear panelists, I'm Anahit Ghazakhetsyan, poet translator, as well as the moderator of the Poetry and Truth panel, which is dedicated to thorough discussion on poetry, which always been a personal, almost physical release or solution to a complex pressure of needs, wanting to create, to justify, to praise, to explain, to externalize, depending on the circumstances. We will talk with the amazing poet sitting here next to me. We're going to talk about the personal experience, the meaning, the place of poetry in their lives. And after the main part of the discussion, I will also invite you to ask questions to the whole panel or to the panelists, certain panelists. So let me introduce our poets. So far right from me sits Martin Solotruk, poet translator. His poems appeared in several anthologies in Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Mexico, and the United States. He is also the director of Ars Poetica International, a poetry festival and publishing house. Next to him sits amazing Lily Michaelides, a poet who published 6 collections of poetry. Her bilingual poetry collection, Arena, was shortlisted for the National Poetry Award. And in 2006, she co-founded Ideogramma, which organizes literature festivals and poetry events, local as well as international. So, next to her, Claudio Pozzani, a poet, narrator, musician. He is appreciated in Italy and overseas for his poetic performances in the most important international literary festivals. Since 1995, Pozzani has been the director of Genoa International Poetry Festival in Italy, and he founded Versopolis, the biggest poetry portal arena in Europe. So, Artur Mesropyan, a representative from Armenia, poet, translator, he published the book The Flying Home, and he is also conducting research on literature at the Yerevan State University. So, another amazing representative from Armenia, Hamlet Arakelyan. So, he is a poet, translator. He published the novellas To Denver, Replacement, a collection of With My Inner Self. In 2018, he published a collection of original English poems called Tantric, and in 2022, a novel, The Academy of Immortals. He's also author of some scientific articles and also lyrics. And last but not least, Anastasia Sorokina from Russia. She's an author of several books actually for children, poetry, and as well as translations. She's winner of the Kniguru Prize for the best work for children, the translation prize named after Solomon Apt, shortlisted for the debut prize, and she's also the winner of the Krapivna Prize. So, thank you all, and I'm going now to start the main discussion with our poets. And to begin with, in one of his interviews, Leonard Cohen was asked, "What you got into poetry?" So here is response, well, I don't know. I thought that this was the way to kind of win women's hearts. So the interviewer responds, well, did it work? And Cohen says, yes, it did, indeed. So my first question is the same. If you could recall, what precisely got you into poetry? We can start from whoever wants, or we can start from Anastasia, so she's just sitting next to me, if you want.
It's always difficult to be the first one to answer. As far as I remember, I started writing when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and that was my favorite occupation. And since that time, I didn't want to do anything else but writing poetry and short stories, some kind of short stories. And even my prose, when I do it, it's still poetry, I suppose. Although it's written not in lines, but it's still poetry. I absolutely adore poetry, and I like to translate it and sometimes to write it. So that's the story from the childhood itself.
I'll go next. First, thank you, Anahit, for organizing this talk. It's thrilling to be among fellow poets and people we share the same world with. I think my first poem that I've ever written was when I was 14, and I clearly remember that day. I knew nothing about poetry or literature or text in general. So I was walking with my friends nearby a local gym, and like for a moment I realized that I really want to just fix that moment in some way that was possible at that moment, and the only kind of means that would let me fix that moment were lines. And when I got home, I just wrote a poem that never got published because I never liked it afterwards. But I guess that was the first kind of introduction, and it was all about fixing a moment and trying to fix a moment that felt like home to me. And since then, poetry always brings me back home.
Sorry, what was the question? Come again, please. Oh, my first encounter. Thank you. First, let me thank you for encountering all of you before coming to poetry. So, well, speaking about the first encounter, it's difficult, you know, to bring back the memories when the first encounter was. Maybe it was very well in school. I think everyone starts with school, first contacts with poetry. But what comes to personal experience, I've never given a thought of this. Maybe it was when I was a student at university. I think back then everyone was trying to emulate some of their, favorite poets, some from, I don't know, 20th century, Arthur Rimbaud, or Verlaine, or many others, some from 20th century. So maybe I was also under such impressions, trying to emulate some of them. So I think, it was back when I was in student years. So if that was the question.
Sì, okay. Innanzitutto thank you all of you, and my first memory for poetry is one very famous poet in Italy, Ungaretti, that in television read some part of Odyssea, and I was about 70 or 8, and I said, I want to be like him, and my dream was to live with my poetry or with my art. When I was 70, I became a rock singer, so I thought that become a rock star, but was not. But then with poetry, I travel around the world. With my festival, I host a lot of poets around the world, like Ferlinghetti and many other. So I think I'm very lucky and happy man because I live with my dreams. But the first poem that I remember was around 10, and I said to my mother, I wrote a poem, and my mother said, okay, it was Christmas, so you can read for Christmas to all the relatives, and but it was a poem about death. And the people smiling, then was not smiling. So I thought that all my life was to make something opposite of the people believe. So, excuse me for my English, but the same.
Good evening. First of all, I have to say thank you very much. This is my second trip to Armenia, and I'm very grateful. There was something that was waiting for me in Armenia again to come back. Well, I didn't start writing when I was young. I started writing, I used to read a lot. Not a lot of poetry, but a lot of fiction. And I thought that poetry it's beyond my expectations. I couldn't think of myself writing poetry, but all of a sudden, when I visited India, before the 21st century, I felt something strange. When I came back, I started writing. And I sent my writings to some friends, poets, and they told me, well, there is something there, so keep writing. I didn't even think of what I have written was a poet. So this is how I started writing poetry. I mean, I couldn't say just by coincidence, but I think in English they call it a provident moment, that everything comes together and there is a spark and you change your way of seeing things or your way of walking towards your life. Thank you.
Also, thank you all. And I'm still contemplating if I ever began writing poetry, because writing poetry, in my mind, is something that you are as if in a pursuit of God, whose name you do not know. It is something, to me, writing poetry or poetry is exaltation as well as some sort of, let's say, pantheistic feeling that, exactly as Lily said, that it's a provident moment, that one feels bliss, that he was as if she was, that your mind was in certain sense with ongoing visitation of inspiration, which is, we don't know coming from where. To me, it has always been an act of profound inspiration. That's why I don't write. I only have 5 books as of now of my own, and was only full-fledged books were only published in 5 languages. But at the same time, I think that beginning writing poetry can begin at any time, even now. Can be the moment when we are ongoing some visitation.
Thank you, and thank you all for the amazing opening and such amazing stories. And let me go on and read for you the second question. So, Maya Angelou actually escaped to a hotel room to write. Virginia Woolf did her best work at a standing desk. Lewis Carroll wrote in a purple ink. According to these writers, all these rituals or habits help them to write. So, what gets you started in writing a poetry? Is it an image, a rhythm, a situation, an event? Do you have rituals in general when writing? Martin, you may start again, or just...
Why not? Rituals can be good, of course, but I think rituals are, as far as I know, mostly fine for prose writers or writers whose work requires some kind of systemic effort on an extensive level or scale. For me, writing really comes in flashes. I can write. If I was too proud, I could say I could write at any moment, even now. But the other question is, why should I write? And I can only write when I feel that there is something extraordinary, as if occurring in my mind. And yes, rituals can be perhaps good, like with top sportsmen, that you have certain rituals to get to top form. So for me, if I have any ritual, then it would be long walks. We mentioned Rimbaud. I think there would be no Rimbaud if there was not for his long walks, and I will always remember that. So that's one of my rituals.
To tell you the truth, I always need a sparkle to write. But there are moments that I'm trying to write even my writing is rubbish. Because I talked to a very good friend of mine, a poet in Greece, and I said, I'm keep writing, but I write nonsense. And he told me, write nonsense, but keep writing. Because what I'm trying to say is that, okay, for me, this is how it works. I write, and I leave it somewhere, and I try to see it after a couple of days or even weeks. If it speaks to me, then I will work it a little bit more. Sometimes it's ready by the first writing, but sometimes I throw it away. And lately, because of the period of COVID and all this psychological unbalance of everywhere in the world, I feel that I need to keep writing even if I write nonsense, and see if something is good, if not. This is how I proceed.
Well, I write poetry and prose, and I think that there is the same difference. Is completely two arts different for me. I compared, for example, poetry to the photograph and prose to the cinema. It's the same. You use the same instrument, but is a different kind of approach to the art. And I live in a country, but now is everywhere like this, that almost everybody write poetry, and almost nobody read poetry. And I write because I read a lot of, and it's like for me, write is a continuum of my reading, and is like to read my soul and put on the page what I understand of myself and the world around me. And the second meaning for maybe is to understand if there is some other human being in the same wave, synchronization of me. And this is because I think that the most part of inhabitants of world are someone that with I have nothing to do. So.
Okay, speaking about rituals, I think that, I have not been writing quite much poetry over recent years. I mean, it has different reasons, both objective, as it was already mentioned, like COVID, wars that we are continually having, and also maybe some subjective reasons too. But when I think back about rituals, I go back to the, period when I was writing poetry, perhaps a poem at least once a week, maybe even more often. And when I try to analyze after your question, maybe I can see this picture. Well, I'll tell you the story. So when I was trying to have like contact with people and basically having some trouble, I would understand that I was trying to put myself in situations where I would be both desperate and in a circle of, self-destructive circle where I would be like left speechless, and poetry would be my resort to pour this out of myself, and each poem would be addressed to a very specific case and very specific person. And every poem that I've ever written is addressed to a very specific person, every poem that I've ever written. And when I was writing them, I would never think about, collecting them in a poetry book, but they were first rather sent in messages or chats or, I don't know, in these kind of forms, because they were, addressed to certain people. And they were just like expression of the situation for me. But later I understood that these self-destructive circles should somehow be broken, and later that's what I did. And I would even agree with my fellow poet here, that when he says that poetry and prose are quite different, because what I did was I tried to move myself from writing poetry to shift to prose, because prose is something which leaves you more space, more air, and more room. And personally, I can feel better when I write prose. Coming back to your question, I think the rituals in my case were quite harsh and not really something I would like to go back to. These self-destructive circles which would go back and forth, come back and forth again, and maybe this was the that this was the ritual, which maybe I don't really want to go back to.
I also really like the metaphor of poetry being the photography and then prose being the videography, we can call it. Honestly, I was thinking and I realized that I have no rituals and I don't even have control over that experience. I would call it like an otherworldly experience that just like emerges inside me or my soul, and the only thing I have control of is to either let it flow or not. And it usually happens in the middle of, I don't know, it can be an official meeting, it can be even a party, it can be just a walk. But when it happens, I usually just sit down and take whatever I have. I can even record myself, type it down in my notes. If I have a piece of paper, I write on it. And most of my most important poems were born in the middle of very random situations where I just left and sat in a corner and started writing.
As I said, I was a bit nervous starting this conversation and forgot to say the main thing. I forgot to say thank you, Stan. This gorgeous, enormous, very beautiful, warm country. And of course I wish peace and love to this country as well as to all the countries in the world. And what about rituals? Our poet Marina Tsvetaeva said that she liked notes covered with, copybooks covered with leather. Very beautiful copybooks. even posh, but she said that the worst poems were written in this very notebook. So to write poetry, you don't need, I think, any rituals, you don't need any special notebooks, any special situation, and the best poetry comes randomly, comes without, when you don't expect it. It's according to my experience, to my opinion. So that's the situation. And when you posed this question, I remembered Aristotle, who philosophized while walking. So that was the way of thinking of this philosopher. He was walking, and during this action, he had most beautiful, had most important thoughts. So probably that's the way of writing.
Thank you all for the answers, and in my head there are so many actually follow-up questions to each of you, and it's very interesting because while you were talking I was trying to connect it to me and to simply recall the situations I was in similar situations. And if I may add, from my personal experience, I write sometimes, I have very few pieces, prosaic pieces, and it's very interesting that I'm easily working and editing all the time the prose. When I write poetry, this may be a ritual. I feel like it's a sacred text, some kind of, and it took me a long time to simply touch the poem that is already written. Change a word, change a punctuation, change something in the poem, and it's hard. It's self-destructive kind of. I don't know, for a poet, I think. Not it, yeah. Yeah. So let's proceed with the third question, and I'll ask Claudio to start from the middle. So this day is like some days ago. We're talking about poetry with a friend of mine, and she asked me, how do you identify a poem? So I'm wondering for you, where a poem can be found? What is this indispensable part, indispensable element that makes something a poem?
It's very long, but shortly, I think that poem has a very element. Of course, the meaning, of course, the rhythm, of course, the atmosphere, that complete atmosphere of the poem, and the choose the right words. So it's near to alchemy, I think, because poetry is something that is very, for example, when you can write prose and decide to wake up and go to the table and write. For poetry is not possible, at least for me, to say, okay, now I write a poem, because it's something that is more like an electric charge, and you don't know when and how this came in you. Then you can work on it with the ration, with the method. But the birth of a poem is something really magic, for me. And maybe I understand that she spoke about working, because the most part of my poem born when I walk, and there is also the rhythm of my.
So if I just make it a bit more clear, so we read a poem by Whitman, and like we know that's a poem. We say good things, we say bad things about, and there are things that like we read and like meh, no.
Yeah, for music is simple because you know when something like this. No, with the poem is more difficult. But as I said. You can sing when you go take a shower. You sing, but you are not a singer. And the same very often with the poetry. Maybe you write some sentence very beautiful, very touching, but it's not poetry. And how is the difference? Is something inside? I don't know. You can explain, but you feel that this is good poetry, this is not poetry. Is something, but this arrive if you read a lot of poetry, so you can recognize the good poetry or not. For me.
Yes, I believe there are rules sometimes, and a lot of people nowadays, they are taking classes for creative writing. I did this once many years ago in Oxford just for fun, but I don't believe that you learn how to write good poetry. So what is a good poetry? I think this is subjective, okay? Because this is very good for you and this is not very good for me. But the good poem, it's something that you cannot object. I don't know how to explain it. When you read a good poem, even if you don't understand it sometimes, you say this is a good poem. It's the rhythm, as Claudio said, is the construction of the poem, is the words that are used, is the images that are inside. But I have to say something. A good poem 50 years ago is not the same as a good poem now. I mean, people are different, and the expression is different, the writing is different, and I don't know if we can put it in a methodology to say what is good or bad, but we have so much opportunities to read and to listen to many people, many poets, and I don't know, it's not easy for me to say and to put it into words how or if one poem is very good and not. I don't know.
You just recognize it completely.
For instance, just a few words. Lately, I discover Ocean Vuong. I don't know if any of you know him. He's at the top of the list now in America. He's a Vietnamese American. Ocean Vuong. He's about 30. He's in his 30s. And I read his poems and I said, he's a great poet. You know, I felt it. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt it. And maybe he's...
One of my teachers, spiritual teachers in the art of poetry, once told me one simple sentence. This is interesting. And you know why? Because I have never read it. I have never read anything comparable. And of course, in this sense, I would completely endorse what Claudio said. If we take poetry as the art, not just as some kind of method of confession, of method of blah blah, then of course the art requires its artistry, and that artistry has its magic. That artistry has got its levels of sportsmanship, but also levels of consciousness. And I think poetry is a way, it's a journey to the possible oceans of consciousness. And that ocean is in many ways as large as we can imagine in language. So I think there are so many possible good poetries, in many ways as the stars in the sky. But at the same time, yeah, how do you know it's there? Because you can sense it, because it shines in its own way. And it has never been seen before. Okay, that kind of thing.
Okay, so a good question. So where to find poetry? Well, I've been asking this question myself for maybe at least 3 years now. And the answer till now is that I can't really find poetry anywhere, at least for the recent times. I'll tell you this story. So it was back in 2020, and it was the month of October, I think, well, the end of October. And everyone who's been living in Armenia back then knows what period it means for every Armenian. So I was at home, and we were doing renovating. We were renovating my home, my apartment, and we were, well, having these bookshelves, the furniture for my home, and we were on the bookshelf part, and I was to put some books in my bookshelves that day, and the TV was always on, as in every house maybe, and we were like listening to this news, no good news naturally, and I was trying to put the books, and it was poetry basically, and I picked the book. It was Robert Burns, and I decided to read a little of Robert Burns. So before that, of course, I had read lots of poems by Robert Burns, and so I decided to read it on that day, and it was completely different experience, and the experience was something that has been haunting me until today. And the experience was that it was absolutely ungenuine, false, so untrue, and so deceptive. I felt like I've been like dictated all my life with this poetry and these poems. And I was reading and reading, and the TV was on, and the contrast between what was on TV and what was I reading, this gap was so huge. I can't still feel in this gap until now. And what I did was, I didn't put those books on the bookshelf. I collected them in a pack, and I threw them into the rubbish bin. And I'm not still sure if what I did was correct or incorrect. I'm not sure until today. But what I'm sure is that poetry, general literature and poetry in particular, is undergoing huge transformations. And these transformations, I think, are equal to those which were made after World War II, because literature before World War II and afterwards are completely different. And I think that, I don't know how will come out of all these conflicts, but I'm sure we're not going to be the same, and the literature will not be the same. So where to find poetry, I don't know, but I don't find poetry anywhere, because as my colleagues just mentioned, the previous colleague, he said that his mentor told him that when he reads, he says, this is interesting. So it means that piece of poetry should have something which can grab you, which can grip you, which can, well, touch your heart, touch your soul, touch your emotions. That's why it's interesting. Nowadays we're living in a period where our emotions are so, well, overgripped, overgrasped, overgrabbed, that well, we are numb now, I think, to poetry, at least I am. So, well, that's why I think that nowadays I can't find poetry anywhere, and I can't even find poetry in the, well, classic poems. So, I don't know, this is my answer to your question.
Yes, a rather very interesting and pessimistic view, but I'm gonna, yeah. No, just...
I was thinking while the guys were talking, and I was trying to come up with like a definition that would encompass what poetry is, and I thought of this sentence: maybe poetry is a textual vibration of truth that resonates with the reader. Because I believe that every text has the right to be, but the way it affects us, like the way it moves us, can be different, and sometimes that's what defines its value. It's a short answer.
I do agree with Martin. It's a moment of something, of an astonishment, of something unexpected. Even if it's 1 second or less than a second, but this sense you understand that you haven't seen it before. That's a great thought, really. And the great poet, Armenian Hovhannes Tumanyan, who was also a great translator, said that a poetry translation is like a flower, maybe a rose, I don't remember what he exactly said, covered with under the glass. You see its beauty, but you can't feel how it smells. So this very smell is the sense of poetry. It's something you can't understand, you can't explain, but you do feel it. Once I had an experience in Belfast, and we translated, not me, my colleagues translated Mandelstam's poetry. It's extremely difficult and sophisticated poetry. And when I saw the English translation, I understood that it has lost everything. It has lost poetry itself. And what we see is only lines and text. So, unfortunately, sometimes poetry turns into text when it is translated. And sometimes we have in the original only texts and not poetry. And how to distinguish it? It's just the question of your own sense and your own feeling.
Thank you all for the beautiful, interesting, and Arthur also guessed my the next question actually about transformations. But I just wanna before that I just wanna quote Allen Ginsberg. He has a rather long poem. It's called Writing Poetry. I write poetry, and he says, I write poetry because World War First, World War Second, and there may be World War Third, but I don't want it to be, so I write poetry. So maybe we'll start with Arthur about transformations. Arthur, what do you think, how the world itself, like all these wars, everything going on, is it somehow, of course it's affecting poetry, but is it changing the ways that poetry can be written?
Well, thank you for the question. I'll answer only, of course, for myself, but I think, yeah, after these huge transformations, I think that mostly poetry will be dead. It will be dead. That's my vision, how I see it. Of course, many people are going to write poetry. Of course, people are going to do it. But the form itself has already, I believe, consumed itself. What I believe is coming is not poetry, neither even novel. We are going to have non-fiction. Non-fiction will be the future of textual reality, I believe. Because even if you follow the trends, the publishing trends now, you'll see that the number of non-fiction books is growing, not even year by year, but even month by month. And numbers, I mean, the ratings and by all means, non-fiction non-fiction is becoming more and more popular. What is this? Well, I'll just give you this picture. So this way or that way we're touching the conflicts today because we are living in a world which is full of them. But if you go back to 18th century conflicts, let's say Napoleonic Wars, yeah, you'll have these big pictures, big paintings of Goya, you'll have paintings of David, you will have lots of other paintings which are, well, they are poetic, they are heroic. If you speak about modern war, you can use maybe all sorts of words, but you can't say that they are heroic, because we are living in a world where conflicts are mostly solved by machines, robots, techniques. So this means that the room for poetry is less and less, smaller and smaller. And I don't see in the future how this small room can be filled with poetry. I see that the door is closing on poetry. As I mentioned, many people will disagree with me and they will continue writing poetry, but it won't change much. I believe that in the future the general populace will be inclined to reading non-fiction, more practical and more down-to-earth texts. What it means for poets, of course they are going to write. Some of them are going to write poets, some of them are going to be maybe successful, but generally I think that the century of poetry is going to close like those of dinosaurs. Yeah, this is my perspective.
Thank you, Hamlet. Just Martin asked to go second, if you won't mind.
It's always nice to see when somebody has this broad-based apocalyptic vision of poetry. It's poetry in its own way. I don't know how productive is it, but let's start from there. Because honestly, of course, not all that. I would be equally apocalyptic as you if I didn't believe in the innate power of poetry, which is not artificial. It's innate energy that comes out of your cells, if you like, or your stamina, your brain, and so on. And no corrupt stage in this world will ever stop the energy and flow of life. Otherwise, we can all just pick up and die in the encirclement of depression. But I would hope that that's not the case. And let's remind ourselves of the history books. The most important changes and highly interesting revolutionary movements in poetry just happened after World War I, for instance, yes, for very good reasons. And out of the climactic, out of the ashes, oftentimes miracles rise up. And once again, I believe that poetry is innate energy, logos, that has been around with this world ever since its inception, and no war is ever going to stop it, not permanently. If you want to write more non-fiction, go ahead, and there'll be many more who will write more non-fiction, and they will come back to earth, but that earth will be non-fiction for themselves. There'll be always people who seek poetry as they seek love or sport or swimming in the sea, and just being one with the oneness of the world.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll be among the first to disagree with you, Arthur, because I believe that saying that non-fiction is going to be dominant, or it is dominant, is equal to saying that the humanity has stopped dreaming and moving itself away from fiction, which is among the roots of our development as species, our thought processes and everything. And I guess that Anahit's question was more about the transformation of poetry. And I believe that we will never, as species, stop dreaming or envisioning or creating things, but just the way we do it is transformed. I was in Dubai Expo this summer. Don't know if you've ever been there, but the pavilion of the United Kingdom had this very cool installation of an artificial intelligence creating poetry with the words you give it. So you were typing down like 3 words, and then a piece of poetry was coming up. Is this poetry or is it not? It's different. I believe that maybe the world is going towards more technological, development, and everything is becoming very, full of technology. Maybe that's the transformation that poetry entails as well. But saying that it's going to be dead means like putting an end to us as species as well, which is not the best scenario, I believe. And I also think that it will never happen, or we will not know about it, so it won't matter.
Me? I forgot what I wanted to say. Well, Winston Auden said that literature and poetry in particular don't change anything in the world, in people, so he didn't believe in this power of the word. It's strange to me because Auden was a great poet. What I think is that we are standing on 3 whales. It's Eros, Thanatos, and Logos. And Logos, it's whatever you want it to be. It's poetry, it's prose, it's historical writing, anything. Poetry is the most ancient genre. It won't die, I think. It will be going with us through all the turbulences of our times. I can see that lots of my friends in Russia and in Ukraine have started writing amazing poetry recently, and it's really valuable poetry and necessary poetry in these days. So that may be the answer to the time, the answer to death even. And I strongly believe that poetry won't leave us so far as we are living. So maybe when the humanity dies, then the poetry dies.
Well, first, I think that the violence starts when you have no more words. In this case, poetry above all, giving always new words, can be an instrument of peace, because more you have a rich language, more you keep away the violence. The problem in this era is the language. For example, they made a study that Italian people in average use only 400 words. So the vocabulary is very, very short. And if you speak poorly, you think poorly, and you live poorly, and you are more violent because you have no words, so you have something, another language to be understood. And I think that poetry is a great paradox, because it's always the same since thousand years ago, the same, but is continuing changing, because the language changes, because the humanity changing, now changing worse, but is something that is like an engine that is in continuous movement, but is still. So it's a very paradox, and the strength of poetry is that something that changes constantly, but never change for me.
Yeah, I believe so. On the contrary of what other people say, that poetry, literature in general, they don't do anything in the world. No, I believe they do. They do really something very extraordinary good. And let me tell you just a few examples. Even the politicians, when they talk, they use poetry. They use the language that the writers use in order to show that they are intellectuals. And in many other fields. Even if you write a poem and even someone read this poem and from one sentence sees behind the facade, sees things in a different way, this is what you gain out of your writing. I mean, it's very important for people to read. If they read, they really can change their way of seeing things and their lives as well. This is what is happening to me, and I believe to all of you. I mean, we learn through reading, we learn through poem. Even if we don't understand the poem, we feel the poem, as we said before. And that feeling makes us better people. Lately, I mean, a few months ago, I had a baby about 4 or 5 months old, and I started reading him a small poem, I mean, with rhyme. And he was looking at me. He didn't understand anything, but he felt it. So I think poetry and prose and whatever is been called literature, I think it's very important, and it's changing the world. It can be changed in many ways.
If I may just briefly add, I would still come back to this challenge of fiction versus non-fiction. I think it's important to stress it, to remind ourselves that not only that poetry or literature develops what they call critical thinking, which is ever rarer in this world, because any time when there is time of war, let's face it, we all are pushed into some kind of dogmaticism, whether we like it or recognize it or not. It's part of the hybrid threat that is imposed on all of us across this world, because that's the way history teaches us. And at the same time, I would very much like to point out too that even in philosophy of information, you find information, that poetry brings information, as a matter of fact, very much alike, let's say, non-fiction writing. It's obviously a different kind of information, but the very essence of the information.
Thank you for comments, especially on my speech. So, well, basically, first I would like to mention that I would be very glad to be wrong that it's dying, actually, because I don't want to. Well, I don't want poetry to die. But on the other hand, I want us, and first of all, I want me to be realistic. And well, of course, and personally, I can say a lot of beautiful words about poetry, its importance, its life-changing and transformative powers. But I believe it would be at least not honest to me, because well, what I see is that there are some facts which we can't neglect, and facts are stubborn. And well, you can talk to any publisher, and you can, well, scan any book purchases figures, and you'll see that everywhere around the world the sales for poetry declines. And by the way, this decline started after the World War I. You mentioned it. So World War I was this peak. That the point is that the question was what transformations are coming. So that's the point what I'm making. The transformations is that I believe that the well, room for poetry is going down and down, and I'm very glad that some people, as I already mentioned, are going to write. As I mentioned, some people are going to write poetry, and so I'm glad for those people. Yeah, I'm really glad for them.
Thank Thank you for spicing up the discussion, actually, because it's turning to be very interesting. And I want to say that, of course, I believe that poetry will live and live on, no matter what, because I do believe in the power of words. And as mentioned by Martin, Lost Generation, then Big Generation, then the theater of absurd and everything. All this was born from a catastrophe, actually. It's a consequence somehow. And these times, like, we are awaiting for some really inspirational, for some aspiring poets reborn from all these ashes, actually, that are left now. But what I want to ask next is actually about the experimentalism in poetry, because you see from after, for instance, the Second World War, we see these transformations, this experimental churn in almost every type of arts, like in music, like Stanakis, he used mathematics in music, or Picasso, he starts like painting something completely different from early Picasso. And then in France, the theater of absurd, it's completely different kind of literature. So what I want to ask is that when we see a woman in Picasso's painting with two noses, it's fine, it's like completely understandable, but we don't see it as usual in poetry, like as we see in other arts. What do you think? What's the reason behind this? And also the second question is that, have you ever tried something experimental, your own poetry? Thank you. Who wants to start? Hamlet? Okay, of course. Thank you.
As you mentioned before, you visited the Expo of Dubai, yeah, and except of the extravagant ambience, you saw that pavilion with the artificial intelligence methods. Yes, I mean, world is changing. Everything is changing in all aspects, in all fields. So, because I'm an organizer of a poetry slam, except of the festival, I do the poetry slam in Cyprus. I started I feel that there are many ways for poetry to be expressed and to be written. That's why I said before that I don't know how to explain what is a good poetry or not a good poetry. With the new way of expressing poetry, and especially how the people perceive this expression, I found out that at least in Europe nowadays, it's the most hit thing is the presentation of the poetry, and of course the good words, because in Islam competition, it's a competition. You judge the performance, the presentation, and also the words. And believe me, you can read very, very, very strong and very passionate poetry, because Islam is to express strongly about a feeling or something that happened either to you, or political or sexual or whatever. So it's important for us poets to understand that poetry has a lot of ways of expression and a lot of ways to be written. I try to experiment myself too. I try to write with signs. For instance, instead of I say the knife, and instead of writing down the knife, I put a photograph of a knife. I'm trying to experiment myself too. I don't know if I manage or if it succeeds, but anyhow, I'm trying to follow the way the new era which is around poetry right now in all over the world. I'm open to any ways of writings and expressions, yes, and I read a lot of new experimental poets, so I appreciate that.
It's like no, not you. But once things very strange, but not. The three most important avant-garde of the 20th century: Futurism, Surrealism, and Dadaism. All three that touch of the whole field of the art. All three are founded by a poet. This is something very important. The other avant-garde also that touch some other art like Fluxus, like Gruppo 63, or other, the same are begin by created by poets. So poetry is like a transversal art. So it contains all the arts and is very important also because still now the three most important avant-garde of the 20th century influence the fashion, the architecture, and so is still influenced now. But now I'm not so agree. For example, now there is not avant-garde, there is fashion. So there is some new mode. For example, slam for me is not a kind of poetry, but is more similar to stand-up comedy. And usually when a very good poetry go in a competition of slam, at least in Italy or in France, it arrives always the last, because it's more. Yeah. Then also some other, for example, the Instagram poets that sell a lot of million of yeah, but there is not a new writing. It's only a new mode to vehiculate the poetry. But if you read deeply, for example, Rupi Kaur, that is 10 million. You can see how low level is now the poetry most sold.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're talking about experiment in an experimental way. Okay.
Yes.
I think experiment is always, how shall I put it? It always involves what is being experimented with. To some audiences or to some recipients, what some people consider experiment may be just trash, maybe just, uninspiring, mediocre game, so to say. It depends, at least to my mind, it depends where is the experiment going in terms of, what is its potential and how is that potential employed and deployed. But at the same time, I would like to remind ourselves of this growing tendency to play with artificial intelligence, and how many of you have any insightful understanding of artificial intelligence, and on what level? Unless we have that understanding, what are we talking about, for Christ's sake? We're talking about words being permutated? We must be joking. I mean, if you ask a young programmer of 12 years of age, you program something and it permutates words. So let's permutate more, and that permutation can be permutated further. So where have we gotten? Where are we? What's the essence, what's the achievement of that? I wonder if we understand and have feedback on that artificial intelligence, and those results are as if backtracked and read back into the artificial intelligence, only if we understand what is it doing to the artificial intelligence, because it does something. The artificial intelligence has great difficulty decoding poetry, real poetry, enigmatic poetry. That's always the last frontier for the artificial intelligence. But at the same time, artificial intelligence can, of course, toss in the air and grab it back. It can explode, implode, it can do all kinds of things. Yes, because for it, it's normal. Yes. I always ask myself, where is the creativity? If there's any creativity in that, then it must be creativity of the programmer, but most programmers I know don't have a clue about poetry, so I still wonder.
Okay, so experiments. Yeah, I did some experiments. I started to transform the mental images that I used to have and put them into poems, to put them into let's say more lengthy texts, and it turned out that I started writing prose. So yeah, that was my experiment maybe with poetry, when I tried to give more room to the images that were living in my head, and put them into prose, and maybe that was, in my case, that was transformation from poetry to prose. So it was kind of an experiment maybe, but I liked that experiment. I mean, I started writing prose, and it gave me more energy and vital stamina that was mentioned. I felt it more more powerful in prose. So maybe this was my experiment. I don't know. I do understand what you mean by saying experiments, poetry experiments. I absolutely understand what you mean. But in my case, it went a little bit different direction. It shifted from one literary form to another. Maybe it overlapped from prose to from poetry to prose. Yeah, and that was my experiment. And I think it was pretty successful. I think, at least I like it better.
I'm not a huge fan of non-verbal expressions of poetry when I'm creating it, but I like consuming it. So especially in the modern Armenian, very contemporary writers, we find a lot of graphical solutions to poetry, doing graphical images with the help of lines or words and stuff, which is of course influenced by 20th century mostly. Haven't done a lot of experiments. I love the purity of the textual and verbal forms as they are.
Well, I wouldn't like to disappoint you, but I suppose that experimental poetry is almost impossible, because poets since the First World War have done almost everything with poems. They have written it like this, they have read it in the dark, in the sky, under the ground. They have done everything. And nowadays, it's the only field where one can experience something new is performance, as you told previously. One of the most, I wouldn't say one of the most interesting, but one of the interesting poets I would like to mention is Luigi Socci from Italy. His poetry is such kind of mixture of experimental and traditionalism, and that's interesting. That can be interesting nowadays, because after futurismo and after all these experiments, it's senseless trying to invent a bicycle.
Thank you all for the answers. And before the next question, which is like directly connected to what I'll say now, well, experimental poetry, it's hard to translate, actually. For instance, E. Cummings, he did many things to in his poems to poetry. He tried the usage of like these various like deeply hidden meanings of words. He tried different punctuation and stuff like that, and it's really difficult when you start translating this poetry. And now I want to ask a question about translation of poetry, and especially by a poet. Because when I just started translating 3-4 years ago, I was reading memoirs of Anna Akhmatova. And she has a very interesting thought that like haunts me till now. So I'm gonna read it. It's just a sentence. She says, I was finally convinced that translations are disastrous for a poet. Creative energy flows away, and that suffocation is form which absolutely cannot be fought. So what do you think about translating poetry? Can it really simply take away your creative energy, the process of thinking, the process of finding words, process of making a form, a new form for a poem in your mother tongue? Yes, of course.
Well, I might sound again positive to this. Yes, I'm very grateful to the translators, I have to say. Even if the translation, of course, let's face it, without translations, we will not be here. And people could not get to know unless if they are familiar with so many languages. So for me, it's a great thing, the translation. There are good translations, there are bad translations. Okay, I'm not talking about this, and I don't want to express any idea of who is a good translator or not. But I'm telling about myself. Even me, I was reading lately a book of Michael Longley, and in order to understand it, I translated the whole book. I'm not a translator. My translation is just it's a free translation, more or less. So I understood the poems, and because I read a lot of other of his poems into English and into Greek. So for me, the translation, it's one way to go through another one's poems, another one's works, and to open my horizons, because, okay, I live in a country, I do what I do, but to open my horizons, I have to open my readings, to be open to different kinds of expressions. So translation for me and translators are very important.
I myself, I'm a translator of poetry as well as some other things. I translated some of the more intricate, or perhaps most intricate poetries of 20th century, including John Ashbery and others, and including E. Cummings. But at the same time, I would like to say that translation, at least in our country or in our region, is considered an art in its own way. It's even in law. You know, when you sign a contract, it's not commercial contract, it's contract for the arts, so to say, delivery. And my teachers and myself, I have really appreciated a lot of joy doing the translation. It can be, of course, a hard job, but once you get, so to say, into it, it's like getting into love, you know. Once it begins functioning, it can be highly rewarding, but you need to get there first. And the most, so to say, enigmatic thing and magnificent thing about translation of poetry can perhaps be that you actually, as if teach that author speak your language, and you even have to sometimes shape or even a little bit maybe violate or really shape your native language into that author. That's the magic of translation, that that author somehow magically sounds hopefully beautifully and interestingly in a foreign language, which itself is a new entity, it's a new artistic entity, and that artistic entity would not have existed without the translation. It has got a life of its own, and that life, to give birth to that life, is not always easy, an easy delivery, but it can be highly rewarding.
Just to add something, that it's very interesting that some poets can simply by listening their text in the translated language, they can guess which text is that, like by the rhythm, by the intonation and everything like that. It's pretty interesting. So Claudio?
I answer both as a translated poet, as a translator. I translate from French, and is strange also this, because, for example, there is at least 10 translation of Fleur du Mal de Baudelaire in Italian, that all the translation very different one from the other, are very good, all the translation, because maybe someone is more priority the rhythm, the other the meaning, the other the rhyme, and this is very interesting in the field of translation. I don't agree, if I good understood, that experimental poetry is more difficult to translate, because give you more freedom also. For me, it's more difficult translator, a poet very comprehensible, that you have to give in Italian, in my case, exactly the word that he wrote. In experimental, you can also have more freedom. As a translated poet, in some language that I understand less or more, I can say, okay, it's a good translation. But for example, when they translate in Armenian or Japanese or Finnish, you have to trust the translator. It is like give a poem to a translator is give a baby to a babysitter. Can be very sweet person or a serial killer and kill your poem. And when you go abroad, the people know you through the translation. So you are a bad poet or good poet, depending on the translation. Yeah.